everybody. Thank you so much for having me back. I always love being at the Coaching Institute, and I'm especially excited today to get to talk about a big part of my research journey that I've been taking over the last few years, and to share this new part of my researcher identity with you. So what you probably already know about me is that I got my PhD in reading education at the University of Virginia in 2015. The University of Virginia is the home of word study and the Words Their Way phonics program, and so a lot of my teaching experience and my research experience was really focused on that early childhood piece, a particular way of teaching phonics, but definitely sort of science of reading, phonics-y types of topics. Then I came to Michigan State in 2015, and I got to immediately get involved with MAISA, MDE. I got to work with Nell and Tanya Wright on the Literacy Essentials, and I helped create some of the modules content for Literacy Essentials K3, 4, and 5. You may have seen me on some of the videos. And I got to do this training with the coaches that were hired as a result of the Read by Grade 3 law. So I was part of that focus, and I've gotten to be a part of that work with all of you on that focus from pre-K through 3, and how we can, keep kids from being retained, how we can make sure we set them up for a really ideal learning trajectory. So this was great. Everything was going great. And 5 years ago, I would have said exactly what Nell just said. By the way, if Nell was intimidated about following Dr. Clark, think how I feel about following Dr. Clark and Nell, but I'll do my best here. But when Nell said, grades 4 and 5, that's not really my area. That's what I would have said too 5 years ago. But then COVID happened. And COVID impacted our field in ways that we still don't totally understand. And it impacted me personally. I had a kindergartner, my very first kindergartner, in school in 2020, and it was shut down, and our local public schools didn't open again until he was almost ready to go into 2nd grade. So I ended up pivoting my research as a result of COVID, and applied for a grant specifically through a program called Reading Reimagined to look at how to support kids who get to 4th and 5th grade without having all their foundational reading skills in place. What do you do with those kids? Why we can't just forget about them. We can't just, pretend everything's fine. What are the best ways to support children in grades 4 and 5 if we don't achieve that goal of getting them perfectly ready and be perfect grade level readers by the end of 3rd grade? So I have gotten 2 grants over the past 3 years to study how to improve 4th and 5th graders reading, and I've gotten to dive really deep into the research, and I've gotten to work with dozens of 4th and 5th grade teachers, both here and in the state of New York, where I have some research sites as well. And I've gotten to test and listen to kids read, hundreds and hundreds of 4th and 5th grade kids read out loud. And so it's just been a wonderful experience, and it's really made me think that this is, even before COVID, even before we got kids showing up in 4th and 5th grade who missed huge chunks of that early literacy instruction, that this has been an underutilized space, that we weren't thinking enough about how to support these kids. Because in fact, there are research-based practices for 4th and 5th graders and these kids have needs, whether or not they had a big disruption in their instruction. And so I'm really excited to share this with you. I know that 4th and 5th grade teachers have felt left out. I know that coaches have felt that they don't know what to talk to 4th and 5th grade teachers about. And so I want to dig into that with you today. And I want to put that in the context of this sort of science of reading, sold a story movement, because I think there's this idea that everything we've done is wrong and we need to change everything. And in Michigan, I just don't think that's true. I think we've been working towards this point for a long time, and we're actually in a really good position to help these kids. If you look at the NAEP results that just came out, kids in 4th and 5th grade who were in kindergarten and 1st grade during COVID, they are having the hardest time. And we have one more class behind them, who are in pre-K. And those kids have a lot of needs, and there's a lot of things that we need to do to support them. We said that kids were resilient. Some kids were resilient. My kid, fortunately, had a great, is doing great, but not all kids were resilient. And so it's a perfect time for us to start thinking about how to support those teachers and how to support those kids, because they still have needs, and we have evidence. We have great resources available to how we can support them. I also want to say, I know that some of this won't feel as relevant if you are in a pre-K situation, for example. But remember that the 4th and 5th grade teachers have felt that way the whole time. But also, I think something that I've realized in my role at Michigan State is that helping teachers attend to the whole developmental trajectory is actually really helpful. We don't want them just thinking about phonological awareness in pre-K, because phonological awareness is what you do in pre-K. We want them to be thinking about long-term. What do we want for our students by the end of elementary school? What are the goals? And so I hope even if you're not working with 4th and 5th grade teachers right now, you'll engage in this content and the discussion around that, around thinking about helping our teachers set kids up for long-term success. So, as I said, when I first started, my research was very pre-K3 focused. Recently, I've been working in 4th and 5th grade around informational text, multisyllabic decoding, and reading fluency. And now I'm actually doing middle school research. I know, it turns out that reading intervention in middle school is often not that good or evidence-based and really demotivating. And so, this program that I created originally, I created with my partners in 4th and 5th grade has actually now been adapted to a reading intervention program for middle school. I'm not going to get into all that, but we have a lot of work to do in middle school too. And so I'm really starting to push my boundaries and get into this zone of discomfort, and it's been fascinating, and I can't wait to share everything that I've learned. So let's go ahead and just start by thinking about where you feel, how you feel about this idea of adolescent literacy. Now, you may already feel like that word is weird, right? Adolescence? Are we really talking about adolescence? Yes, technically, 4th and 5th grade is considered to be part of adolescent literacy. So that word itself kind of triggers me. But turn and talk and think about what kinds of thinking traps you or people that you work with have about working with kids in 4th grade and up, going beyond 3rd grade. So turn and talk at your table, or if you're online, use the chat. If you're in the room, raise your hands if you have heard someone say some version of one of these, or if you have thought some version of it yourself. Again, these are things that I had as well, so feel free to be honest. So raise your hand if you're in the room. If you're in the chat, you can do a thumbs up if you've heard or thought one of these things before. If kids get solid instruction in pre-K3, what happens in the later grades doesn't matter as much for their reading. Okay, I used to think this. It was kind of self-serving. I was like, what I do is important, and what everybody else does is not important. But yeah, this is, anybody hear or think this one? Raise your hand, raise your hand. Should I make you stand up so that we have more of a, yeah, okay. How about this one? It's not my job to teach phonics, basic reading skills. They should already know that. Yeah. Yeah, we did that in 1st grade. We're done. Yeah, I don't do that. Yep. They already know how to read, so I focus on comprehension. I focus on meaning and loving books. Yep, okay. Let's see. It's all about motivation for older kids. So I use a lot of movies, graphic novels, podcasts, because motivation is the key thing. Now, of course, motivation is important, as Nell explained. But yeah, motivation to do what, I think is the question there. There are so many kids who can't read in the upper grades, so I just use movies and graphic novels and podcasts. Again, I'm in the middle school world now. It is surprising how few books are being read in middle school, ELA now. So this is a thinking trap that we have, that kids don't like reading or that they can't read. And the things that we would want them to read. So we're just going to do other things, keep them engaged, and that's going to solve the problem. We have a lot of research on how to address these problems and how to get out of these thinking traps. So I overplanned for today because there's way too much. There's actually tons and tons of research on what 4th and 5th graders and older kids need to continue their reading journey. It is absolutely critical that we get them off to a great start. I'm so proud of the work that we've done in Michigan to improve that start that kids are getting, but it's not over in 3rd grade by any means. So I'm going to share. Start by talking about an overview of elementary literacy development, what we're trying to accomplish by the end of elementary school and why it's important. Then I'm going to talk about texts, because as you could guess from my thinking traps, one of the thinking traps we get into is around text, and text being too hard, and text being demotivating, and kids not liking texts, and blah, blah, blah. I work with informational texts. A lot of teachers think that kids hate informational texts. That's not true, but we have a lot of thinking traps about challenging text or challenging kids with text. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, because that's one of the major research-based recommendations, is engaging kids with challenging text. And then I'm going to go through evidence-based instructional practices recommended for 4th and 5th grade. I'm not going to get to all of them because I overplanned and we're running on schedule, and I'm not going to ruin the fact that we're running on schedule, but then I'm going to get as far as I can get, and then I'm going to direct you to the resources that I use to put this presentation together so that you can continue your learning journey. So let's start with an overview of pre-K through 5 reading development. Usually we talk about the simple view of reading, so that we say that we're predicting reading comprehension by measuring kids' decoding and linguistic comprehension. And we usually use this in the early grades to talk about why decoding is so important. Obviously, these are equally important factors, listening comprehension and decoding. But generally, when we're talking about the simple view of reading, we're like, well, we have to teach decoding first, right? Because they're not going to be able to read anything if decoding is 0. But what research has shown is that the way to measure these skills actually changes over time. So when kids are in 1st grade, decoding actually is the most important. Like, if you measure how well kids can read words, that you will know approximately how well they can comprehend text, that there's a really close match. Any ideas why that is? Any ideas? Because think about the kinds of text that they're reading in 1st grade. Are they hard to comprehend? No, they don't. The texts that challenge their comprehension and build their listening comprehension are read-alouds generally at that age, right? The texts they're reading are pretty short. They don't stretch their comprehension muscles very much. So their reading comprehension and their decoding are almost the same. By 2nd grade, however, this has evened out. Their decoding skills and their listening comprehension contribute equally. And this is decoding skills measured like how well they can read a list of words. But by 3rd grade, reading fluency, the ability to read quickly and accurately in connected text, has replaced a simple definition of decoding in the model. So you don't measure them how well they read words in isolation anymore if you want to predict their reading comprehension. You measure how fluent their reading is. And that is what takes kids beyond, and that's what's important for supporting reading comprehension beyond 3rd grade. So we're going to talk a little bit about what reading fluency is and how to support it. But sometimes this is misunderstood. People say, oh, well, the correlation between decoding and reading comprehension declines after a certain age. So it's not important after a certain age. It's not only not important if you've mastered it, right? It's only not important if you've gotten to the reading fluency stage. And everybody knows that I love Linnea Airey's phases of word recognition. I talk about these all the time. But most of the talking we've done, when we think about how kids move through the phases of word recognition and get to that fluent stage, most of the talking we've done has been about the pre-alphabetic, partial, and full alphabetic stages, right? How do we get kids who aren't using letters and sounds to use them? How do we get kids who are using some letters and sounds to use all of the letters and sounds? We talk a lot, like all of our phonemic awareness and phonics training is all about helping kids do this better at a letter-to-letter way. But as Nell was talking about, most kids need to move beyond this by 1st grade or 2nd grade. What they move into what's called the consolidated alphabetic phase, and this is where they were using chunks to read words. So they use multi-letter patterns like vowel teams, digraphs, blends, that kind of thing. But they can also use prefixes and suffixes, and we're going to talk about that more in a bit. And they now have a large lexicon of known words that they already know how to read, and they can analogize from that knowledge base to other words. So they still need instruction on how to do this. Lots of our phonics and phonics instruction really focuses on kids in moving those through those first few phases, but this phase is the longest. This is where most kids in elementary school are, and they need support to work through this phase and build more sophisticated word recognition strategies that are appropriate for this age. We're ultimately trying to get them to where we are, which is the automatic phase. which most words are recognized automatically. And if there's a new word that you come across for some reason, you can quickly use word parts and analogy to figure out what it might be. What we have found, what research shows is that we are not doing a great job at actually getting kids successfully through all those phases by the end of elementary school. How many of you are familiar with the decoding threshold research? This is one of the most interesting studies to come out in the last 5 years, in my opinion. This was, I guess it's 6 years now. It was Educational Testing Service. Researchers at Educational Testing Service were able to follow a sample of 10,000 kids from 5th grade through high school and measured their decoding, their vocabulary, their comprehension, and everything using the RISE Read Basics test each year. So they had this longitudinal sample of kids moving through the grades. And what they found was that there is what they call the decoding threshold. Basically a level of word reading ability that if kids meet it by the end of 5th grade, they continue to make progress in their reading comprehension in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade. They continue to grow in the way that we would want to see. But if they do not meet that threshold, their reading comprehension stagnates. They don't continue to make progress in the secondary grades. And basically, and they estimate that about 38% of 5th grade students are not meeting that threshold right now. Now, I could do a whole other talk about what this threshold is and where it is. That's one of the things I'm trying to determine with my research. But it's not simple decoding. It's not one-syllable words. This is the ability to read more sophisticated multisyllabic words. Kids need strategies and the ability to read almost every word they're encountering in a text by the end of 5th grade. And if they don't get that, they're going to have a lot of trouble. One of the reasons is that middle school isn't set up to do a lot of decoding support, right? And not being able to read the words in the text, if we think about the simple view of reading, is going to keep them from comprehending and enjoying and reading those texts fluently. So this is what when we're talking about the beginning reading, we're talking about beginning readers, we're thinking about kids really digging into those decoding processes and switching their attentional resources between decoding and comprehension. So they're slow, they're not really able to read with a lot of speed and prosody in 1st grade. But over time, the goal is to really create decoding processes that are sophisticated and automatic so that most attentional resources can be devoted to comprehension. So we're talking about reading fluency. We're not just talking about reading fast. We're not just talking about sounding nice when you read. We're talking about the ability to read without stopping to figure out the words on the page. That's what reading fluency is, and that's the goal, in my opinion, of elementary reading instruction, is to get to the point where kids can just open a book and get lost in it, and they're not hampered by their decoding skills. So this is what we all want, right? We want kids to open books and have these unmediated experiences with them. And so that's what we're thinking about, how we can get our educators to support that goal. So our goal, if we think about our know, do, and be framework for educator learning around this area, is to really understand how reading develops over time. And that reading doesn't stop developing at 3rd grade, or doesn't stop developing when kids can read words on the page, but continues, it's a continual process. We also want to teach educators to be really asset-based in this space. I'm always hearing from teachers who say their 4th and 5th graders can't read. And then I listen to them read, right? They are reading most of the words on the page. They need help with some of the trickier words. They need help building their fluency and comprehension, but it's not that they can't read. So we really want to think about what kids can do at each stage and challenge them at each stage. We want to help them, teachers use developmentally appropriate research, evidence-based practices to support those kids. And we want to support teachers in having strong self-efficacy in this area. We want them to think about themselves as people who can set up high expectations for their students and meet them. So a lot of the things that I'm taking from today are from these 3 resources. You're very familiar with the instructional practices, the Literacy Essentials Guide. This is a IES practice guide that came out a few years ago that's really informed my work, and that's what I'm going to talk about primarily today. IES practice guides basically bring together all of the research that exists on a given topic and summarize it. It's like a really big teacher-friendly meta-analysis. This is freely available. It's linked in your agenda. I'm going to be summarizing it today, but I highly recommend going in and reading it yourself, because there are lesson plans and great examples of all the things I'm going to be talking about today. And basically, what I think of it is, it's like having Nell Duke in your pocket, basically. You're like, what does the research say about this? And it's like, the research says this. It's like, it's an incredible document. And I think many schools aren't using it because it says reading interventions, right? So it implies that this is research for kids who are behind, or kids who need extra help, who need like tier 2 or tier 3. But actually, all these research-based strategies have also been tested in tier 1. I also work for kids, right, for kids who are in 4th and 5th grade in general. And so it's not just, so basically what I recommend is the practices I'm going to talk about today should be part of tier 1 instruction in 4th and 5th grade, and should be embedded in reading intervention in middle school and high school. But the same practices are appropriate across that grade span. I'm also going to be pulling from Sharon Walpole's book a little bit, Differentiated Literacy Instruction in Grades 4 and 5. So in our IES practice guide, there are 4 main recommendations, and each of these are broken into tiny sub-recommendations, and all the research that supports them is elucidated. It's really, but we're going to go over these 4 recommendations out of order. But the first one is to build students' decoding skills so they can read complex multisyllabic words, provide purposeful fluency-building activities to help students read effortlessly, routinely use a set of comprehension-building practices to help students make sense of the text, and provide students with opportunities to practice making sense of stretch text, i.e. challenging text that will expose them to complex ideas and information. So I'm actually going to start with recommendation 4. And I have 2 reasons for that. One is that this is the goal, right? All of the strategies, the decoding strategies, the comprehension strategies, everything, the fluency building, the goal of all of those strategies is to get them to the place where they can read challenging text, right? So the text, this is the ultimate purpose of using those other instructional strategies. But also, I think this is something that that this showed up in several of our thinking traps. Thinking traps around text, around challenging text, around demotivating kids by giving them challenging text, is one of the most important things that we can do with our 4th and 5th grade teachers right now. We can help them get over those thinking traps, escape those thinking traps, get over the barriers to using challenging text, because this is actually one of the most important recommendations. So a stretch text, as defined in the practice guide, is a selection that is challenging for students to read on their own, which means they're above their independent reading level. A lot of teachers are very uncomfortable with this. A lot of teachers have been, kind of grown up, even if they've moved away from like reading levels or leveled readers, they still believe that they should always have kids in that independent or instructional zone where things are very comfortable for them. And the fact is, they are not going to make as much growth if they're always reading at that level. Now, when Nell talked about pleasure reading, reading outside of the home, extra reading, all that can be at an easier level. That's great. They can read whatever they want, graphic novels, whatever is fun for them to read. That's great. But in school is the time when they have teachers and peers there to support them in reading more challenging texts. So the best use of our instructional time is to do that work with them. And give them an opportunity to build their muscles in those more challenging texts. And so this is one of the reasons that our thinking traps don't work, because we say, oh, they learn to read. But every year in elementary grades, the texts get harder. So there are 20,000 new words in grade level texts each year, and 90% of those new words are multisyllabic. 60 to 80% of them are derived forms of other words. So if you know the word natural, you might not know the word denaturalization, right? There are longer words than others. And new words are carrying the meaning of texts, particularly informational texts. So we have to keep them working in challenging texts just to keep them on the stair step to success that they'll need to be on to graduate 5th grade and get into elementary school. And there's lots of research that shows that the challenging texts are good because they introduce new content. That content area learning happens with challenging texts because they bring in big challenging ideas, sophisticated content area vocabulary, and long complex sentences that they need to figure out how to break apart and make sense of. If they don't get opportunities to do this in the classroom with their teacher, they're probably not going to end up doing it on their own. unless they just have, a crazy literacy professor mom who makes them do it. But this is our opportunity to help them learn how to use these. And I have all these weightlifting images because that's really how I see it. You don't get stronger lifting weights that are easy to lift. You get stronger lifting weights that are a little too heavy, right? Not crazy heavy, you don't want to get crushed, but like just a little bit heavier than what you would normally pick up and carry around. And there's tons of research on this. It's also summarized in the practice guide, but basically opportunities to do that reading in challenging texts improve students' confidence and motivation. Oftentimes teachers have the opposite worry, right? That like giving them something hard will demotivate them and make them hate reading, but the opportunity to be successful with challenging text has the opposite effect. If you can scaffold them appropriately to have a successful experience, that's motivating. It also helps them build their reading fluency and stamina. It doesn't do it in the moment. In the moment, they might read slower because it's a harder text, but over time, they will be able to read harder and harder texts with fluency. It also gives them opportunities to build their world knowledge and that background knowledge because they're able to read a wider variety of texts that are more challenging on more topics. And ultimately, this improves their reading comprehension as well. So we want to do this. We know that better readers read more, that having background and that reading more increases your background knowledge and makes reading easier. So it's a cycle that we want to help kids enter into by the end of the elementary grades. But oftentimes kids are not able to read the target or grade level texts on their own, and then teachers aren't really sure what to do. Have you seen this avoid in-class reading as much as possible? Yeah, have you seen read the hard text aloud to students? Now, that's not to say reading aloud is bad. Reading aloud is still good in 4th and 5th grade, but not to replace the students' opportunities to read, right? Replacing challenging texts with easier ones, or matching students to text at their instructional level. But the only thing that actually works is the bottom. So everything else we're talking about today is number E, provide instructional support for reading difficult texts. And I think, and what that means is understand, so especially in middle school and high school, there's a lot of reading aloud, there's a lot of avoiding assigning hard texts. We wanna make sure that we are not doing that, we're not taking those away. And so there's a way, so when we think about how to support readers in difficult text, we want to think about our readers and where they are. Oftentimes they have more reading skills than we give them credit for. For example, in my projects, I work with schools, I work for 5th grade teachers in schools that are in major urban areas that are often socioeconomically disadvantaged, and where most of the students in the school are below fluency benchmarks, maybe in the 10th to 25th percentile on standardized tests of reading. All of those kids can read most 2-syllable words when I sit down and assess them. What gives them trouble is actually new, longer multisyllabic words that are 3 or more syllables or new vocabulary words. So we want to really think about what kids can do and determine our instructional goals for getting them that next step forward. We also want to think about what makes a particular text challenging, and then consider the instructional support and tasks that we're asking kids to do with that text. And when we're thinking about selecting texts, we can think about the difficulty of the concepts, the difficulty of the vocabulary, the background knowledge, whether this is a familiar topic for students, and then a smaller level, like quantitative measures like Lexiles as well. So this first recommendation is really is highlighted a couple of different places in our 4-5 essentials, particularly in Essential 2, intentional research informs instruction using increasingly complex texts and tasks that build comprehension, knowledge, and strategically reading activities. So this idea that we're on that staircase of text complexity, that we're trying to move kids along to something harder, is baked into Essential 2. Activities that build reading fluency and stamina with increasingly complex text. It's there again in Essential 4, and it's again in 8, abundant and diverse reading material, including digital text and opportunities to read outside the classroom. So it's baked in there in that we don't want kids to just read one type of book. We don't want them just reading graphic novels or just reading their favorite series, although having a favorite series is fantastic, but we want an abundant and diverse reading experience. for our students. So let's, I've been talking for a while, let's do a turn and talk about what we want teachers to know, do, and be in relationship to this stretch text or challenging text concepts. We want educators to know what stretch texts are. And we want to know them, we want to know, or they can use a different term. The terminology is not key. It can be challenging text. It can be, you'd have a different term for it in your district. But, and then why this is important for reading and development. Why it's actually important to not do the thing where you're like, well, I was going to read this book, but it's a lot of work and the kids don't seem to like it, so we're just going to watch the video instead. Like, why is it important to just resist that temptation and really understand that? We want them to choose text for their instruction intentionally based on their instructional goals, identify the things that are going to be challenging that text, and provide the support that students need to be successful in the text. And then finally, we want them to be the teachers who teach the texts, be the 4th and 5th grade teachers, be the English language teachers who still teach books and interesting books and challenging books, and teachers who believe their students can do it, who believe in their students and know that they can support them. So we're going to move on to recommendation 1, which is about building multisyllabic decoding. Now, some of you got to hear me talk about this a little bit last year in one of our breakout sessions, because this is my new obsession. This is what I do and think about all the time. This is a big part of my research project, is how we can get kids up that ladder of text complexity, specifically through helping them read harder and harder words. But there's some great recommendations in here, and it's broken down into 4 parts. 1 is to identify the level of students' word reading skills and teach them vowel and consonant letter sounds and combinations that they need to read the words. So something else we were talking about at the table over here is that 4th and 5th graders who can't read often can read a ton. In fact, in my research study, the students that we were working with could read 85% of the 2-syllable words that I gave them. So that's pretty good, right? They can read a ton, but they do have holes or gaps that they often need to go back and revisit, especially post-COVID, right? Then 2, teach students a routine they can use to decode multisyllabic words. 3, embed spelling instruction in the lesson. And 4, engage students in a wide array of activities that allow them to practice reading multisyllabic words with increasing automaticity. So we're going to look at each of these parts just briefly. When we think about word parts for decoding, all the things that they need to decode single-syllable words, they also need to use in decoding multisyllabic words. Many students just kind of don't know that. I mean, it sounds silly, but they just don't know that it's like the ruby slippers. I'm like, you've had the power all along to read this word, you just didn't realize it, right? And so really helping them make this transition from using their short vowels, their long vowels, their vowel consonant E patterns, their vowel teams and diphthongs and R-controlled vowels, using all of those things, just transferring them. Say, what you know about vowels over here are also things you can use to figure out this word over here. Something that I find in a lot of curriculum, and Words Their Way is a key offender in this area, sorry, Marcia, is that we either teach only single-syllable words or only multisyllabic words. We do not do enough lessons where the 2 types of words are mixed together to allow kids to see that continuum. So you might have kids who are having trouble just generalizing their knowledge of phonics and phonics patterns that they've already learned to multisyllabic words. They often do not need to go back to reading intervention and do a bunch of work with single-syllable words. They often just need help making this leap and really making sure to distinguish between those 2 things. Kids who are below reading level in 4th and 5th grade, the vast majority of them, Freddie Hebert estimates that it's 94% of them, 94% of the kids who are below basic and NAEP do not need to go back to reading intervention that would be appropriate for 1st or 2nd graders. They need help making that step. So it's you have to assess the kids and you have to figure that out. But most of the kids are not going to need 1st grade phonics or 2nd grade phonics. They need help reading multisyllabic words. Now, there's a new pattern here, this consonant LE pattern that doesn't show up in single-syllable words that they can struggle with because it's not obvious how to pronounce it, but it is very regular. The TLE, BLE, KLE, it always just has that schwa sound in that final syllable. So little things like that can absolutely help them, but also just helping them generalize what they've learned about single-syllable words to multisyllabic words. A lot of programs really lean heavily on syllable types. How many of you have 4th and 5th grade teachers who are very attached to syllable types and teaching syllable types? Good. Yes, we don't have to undo too much. So syllable types are fine because in some ways they are just a way of trying to generalize what you know about single syllable words to multisyllabic words. However, we don't want to over-rely on syllable types because what we find is that, well, in my research I found that if a kid can read one syllable type, they can read all the syllable types. Like there isn't this distinction. Like some kids can read one word and what type of word, and some kids can read another the way there is with phonics. So there isn't like a scope and sequence the way there is with phonics patterns where you have to teach each one individually. Most kids are able to kind of get the gist of reading different multisyllabic words once they get over that hump. But also, some of the rules that we teach to go along with the syllable types are really unhelpful in the long run. So one of the things that often comes along with syllable type instruction is this idea that if you have an open first syllable that will have you should try the long vowel sound first. And if you have a closed first syllable, you should try the short vowel sound first. And then you still have to do flexing. They acknowledge that. But that's how you should start trying to decode this word. But Devin Kearns did research where he found that those rules for like what vowel sound to try first only work for 2-syllable words some of the time. So for the closed first syllable short vowel connection, that's only accurate in about 80% of 2-syllable words that kids might encounter in text. And it's only accurate in about 62% of the 3 or more syllable words that kids encounter in text. The longer words get, the more irregular the syllable patterns get. Same thing, and then the long vowel, the open first syllable long vowel connection is even worse. It's only true half the time for 2-syllable words, and it's only true less than 20% of the time for longer words. So basically, it's not that syllable types are bad or having kids practice vowel flexing is bad, that's all fine, but it's not really the same as just teaching kids phonics and having them apply it. There's going to be a lot more work that they have to do to figure out the word. And so what I am recommending and what I'm doing in my work and is also in the practice guide is that we really focus on morphemes. I'm going to run out of time, so I have to move faster. But we focus on morphemes as part of both decoding and meaning-based making. Because this is, when kids are in 4th and 5th grade, they are really focusing in on, they're starting to encounter new vocabulary words in text. Not just words that they know but haven't read before, but they're expected to learn new vocabulary words from text, and common prefixes and suffixes and Greek and Latin roots will help them. So here's a word part lesson sequence. I adapted this from the practice guide. This is also in the slides, which are linked in your agenda. And then we also want to teach kids, the next part, we teach kids a routine for reading multisyllabic words. So BEST is one of the research-based routines. Break it apart, examine the base word, say each part, try the whole word. And then Ishlav or Ashlav is also one of the best researched ones. And I know Annie's going to talk about this more later, so I won't go into detail here. But basically, it doesn't matter what routine. You just want to make sure kids have something in their back pocket for, for decoding these words. So we want to make sure that we're not spending more time teaching rules than teaching words. And not spending a bunch of time teaching kids the right way to syllabicate words. Syllabicating words helps as far as it helps you break it into chunks for decoding. But if you break it into the wrong chunks but read it correctly, that's fine. So we want to focus on applied practice here. We don't want kids to read the word, then syllabicate it. We want them to identify the word part, syllabicate it, and then read the word. If they already know how to read the word, they don't need to syllabicate it. So moving on, we want to integrate spelling instruction also. Helping kids spell the words that you're teaching them will help them solidify them in memory. So there are a couple of, one of my research studies found that kids have a really hard time including morphological information into their spelling. So they spell chewed without thinking about the root word and the suffixes, right? So morphological instruction also helps with spelling. And there's a spelling lesson sequence in the practice guide as well, focused on multisyllabic words. And then you can also do cute things like, Linear Area recommends things like spelling pronunciations to help kids remember how to spell strange words. So re-signed instead of resigned. And then finally, we want to engage students in a wide array of activities that allow them to practice reading multisyllabic words accurately and with automaticity. And there's a range of of examples in the practice guide too, like word sorting, reading with a copy of the routine for multisyllabic decoding right next to you, sentence writing, word list reading, and repeated readings of sentences and paragraphs with tough words. So this connects to Essentials 6 and 7, research-informed and standards-aligned writing instruction, specifically around the spelling. This is where explicit spelling strategies comes in. And also Essential 7, intentional and ambitious efforts to build vocabulary, academic, and content knowledge. And this is where morphology is. I wanted to we spent a little bit more time on this than we will the other ones because there isn't an essential for this, right? You have to kind of pull across essentials to get to the multisyllabic decoding. And this is something that we often talk about morphology as though it's just a vocab building tool, but it's actually a really crucial part of decoding as well. If you think about the way the suffix tion is pronounced, right? Have you ever heard a kid try to read a word, tion? Yeah, we have to teach them that as a decoding unit. We have to teach them that it's shun. Like, they will never get there by going letter by letter, right? Like, so using pulling these things together, pulling spelling, pulling morphology, and pulling multisyllabic decoding together is something that you're gonna have to do for your teachers. You're gonna have to make those connections because it's not explicit in the essentials. All right, so real quick, in your tables, what do you want teachers to know, do, and be in relationship to multisyllabic decoding? Okay. So we want our educators to know the reading challenges for students and how they change over time, that there isn't a binary, kids can read or not read, that they can read words and not read words, that even kids who can read words and are pretty good readers in first grade need to continue the word learning in second grade. Kids who are good readers in second grade need to continue the word reading in third grade, et cetera, that this is an ongoing process. We want them to understand what the keyword parts are, especially how to use morphemes. We want them to teach the keyword parts, teach a routine for reading long words, teach spelling of long words, and provide lots of opportunities for practice reading long words while you're there to scaffold them. And you want them to be teachers whose students cross the decoding threshold before they get to middle school. We want to set kids up for success. All right, so let's move on to recommendation 2, fluency building activities. This I'm not going into as much detail because this is all going to be very familiar. Provide a purpose for each repeated reading, focus some instructional time on reading with prosody, and regularly provide opportunities for students to read a wide range of texts. This is not that different from what you would do in first and second and third grade. The difference is you need to keep doing it. I know 4th and 5th grade teachers are often not comfortable doing fluency support, or they're still doing round robin, or there's often this idea that they're already fluent readers, we don't need to do this. But research shows that it continues to be important throughout the upper elementary grades, and that we want to focus on all the areas of reading fluency. In particular, the practice guide talks about repeated reading and also wide reading. And these fluency supports are still available to 4th and 5th grade teachers. I'm constantly trying to get teachers to do more choral reading, echo reading, partner reading, and to think about these as ways to scaffold that more difficult text reading. If you want your kids to read a text that's going to be a little bit hard for them, this makes it, using one of these supports makes that text way less hard. So combining fluency supports with repeated reading, doing a choral read, an echo read, a partner read in succession, stepping down the level of support can help kids access those harder texts. But also wide reading, which is reading a bunch of related texts and doing fluency support with them, is also an evidence-based practice that's discussed in the guide. So in that case, you might use the same level of support to read 3 related texts about a topic. And this maps very nicely onto essential. Oops, I'm sorry, these are the wrong essentials. But it really maps very nicely onto, I think it's essential 4, which is the fluency building essential. There's not a lot of conflict there. It's just about making sure teachers still see the need to do it. All right, so what do we want teachers to know, do, and be in relationship to reading fluency? We want them to know the components of fluency and understand the relationship between fluency and comprehension. Reading fluently means reading with comprehension. If you're reading too fast so you can't understand, that's not reading fluently. If you're reading so fast that you're making a bunch of mistakes, that's not reading fluently. If you're reading so slowly and getting every word right that you can't put the whole picture together, that's also not reading fluently. So they need to understand the relationship to comprehension. And they need to use those fluency building routines and fluency supports. Every teacher I talk to is like, yeah, I already know that. But they're not doing it, right? So just building that in and providing lots of opportunities for practice. I think we can frame this around the relationship between reading fluently and reading motivation and pleasure. Kids who read for pleasure are reading fluently. If you're not reading fluently, it's not pleasurable. So really think about being a teacher whose kids are reading for pleasure and learning, and make that the goal of your fluency instruction. All right, so I have no time left. So here, this is the last one. I left comprehension for the end for a reason. There are a couple of different reasons. One is that most teachers of older students that I talk to are much more comfortable with comprehension. They're familiar with comprehension strategies. They feel like that's what they're good at. This other stuff, they don't know how to do. This, they feel like they sort of know how to do. So it's an area of more comfort for them. This aligns very well with everything that's already in our essentials. So if you've been working around the fourth and fifth essentials, you're not going to find a bunch of surprising things. You're going to focus on comprehension strategies, text-based discussion, and helping kids use text structure for informational texts. So the three parts of the recommendation are to build students' world and word knowledge so they can make sense of text, consistently provide students with opportunities to ask and answer questions to better understand the text, teach students a routine for determining the gist of a short section of text, and teach students to monitor their comprehension as they read. Nell was already talking about this. This is stuff that, that we are a little bit more familiar with. But the other reason I'm not going to talk about it is that the authors of the practice guide made a podcast where they discussed this recommendation specifically with Jake Downs of Utah State University. So that podcast is linked in your agenda. So you can go in and hear the people who wrote the practice guide talk about this, which is probably better than having me talk about it. But I also did make a bunch of slides that they're linked in your agenda. So you can see, so that you can kind of see how you can use these, when you're working with teachers to help them think about the types of questions they're asking about text, to help them think about how to build a routine for just statements and that kind of thing. So I have one more minute, so we're going to skip this. We're going to, there's a very good essential connections to the essentials across 2, 5, and 7 here. So we're going to skip this, but here's what we want, the turn and talk, here's what we want kids to be doing. We want educators to understand how prior knowledge supports comprehension and what the evidence-based comprehension strategies are. We want them to both build knowledge and teach the comprehension strategies. And we want them to be teachers of students who both are still learning to read and are reading to learn. We want that to be happening, both things to be happening all the time. So I always show this. This is from Miyamoto, a key paper about motivation in adolescent reading. And this comes up a lot with teachers that I talk to. They're very worried about motivation. Motivation isn't in the practice guide specifically as a recommendation, right? And that's because it's as Nell said, it's really entangled with reading skill, and it becomes more entangled with reading skill over time. When kids start kindergarten, there's no correlation between their reading motivation and their reading skill. They love it, whether they're good at it or not, or they hate it, whether they're good at it, but usually it's love. Reading motivation declines over the grade levels, we all know that, but it also becomes more tightly correlated to reading skill as kids get older. So basically, Miyamoto describes the research on this in her paper, and she created this that she calls a vicious cycle. She says kids who are not good at reading are not motivated to read, don't do enough reading, and therefore their skills don't improve, and they get even less motivated, and this compounds over time. But I want us to think about the virtuous cycle. I want us to go the other way. I want our teachers to be thinking about going the other way. We can improve kids' reading achievement and skill. They will read more, they will have good experiences with it, and their motivation will increase, and that will increase their reading, and we'll just keep going around that way. So let's think about plugging into this virtuous cycle and getting kids moving this way through adolescence. I do have a reading intervention that puts a lot of these research-based strategies together called Read, Stop, Write. That's linked in your notes. We're going to publish all the lesson plans this spring, so I'm happy to share those with you. There are some other articles in the, linked in the notes that you can read more about. Here's the podcast, but that's also linked in your agenda that talks more about the comprehension strategies. Thank you. I'm only 2 minutes late. So thank you so much for your time.